Welcome to the second episode of our new podcast, Forward Kenosha Presents. In this series, we will be bringing you stories from around Kenosha County, as well as interviews with a variety of guests. On this episode, I sit down with Peter Barca and Tod Ohnstad, two of our local state representatives, to discuss the Wisconsin state budget and redistricting. Peter, do you want to start by giving an overview of the state budget process?
State budget is a biennial budget, meaning it lasts for 2 years. So it's the most important thing that the state legislature does in any given session because much to my chagrin, much of the policy that's done by the legislature is put into the budget, which I think is unfortunate because that cuts the public out of really participating as actively. Because while the Joint Finance Committee will hold 4 hearings, maybe 5 around the state, it doesn't give the full opportunity that people need to interact with the committee and to go in depth about issues that are of vital importance. So obviously the budget contains all the fiscal projections and allocations that we're going to make for education, for healthcare, for transportation, for all the major programs that fund state government. And for that reason alone, it's important. But additionally, as I indicated, there's so much policy that is crammed in that it makes it very difficult. And I'll give you just 2 examples of things that broke this week that I think the public should be aware of. One is that we just found out in the last day or two that there's $1 billion structural deficit built into the governor's budget. Now, why is that important? That's important because, as we know in the past, when there's been structural deficits, the governor has used that to shortchange education for our children, funding for higher education, which is desperately needed to help propel our economy and have the kind of public-private partnerships that are so important for our state, to cut people out of healthcare because he's argued that the money is not there, to even have resources for road aids for our local governments or shared revenues so that, and other kinds of governmental aid so that teachers or police officers and firefighters can get a raise, which they desperately need after years of, being essentially frozen. So this is a very important revelation and one that is very important that be addressed aggressively. One other point that we've learned in just the last 3 or 4 days that will help to highlight this problem, Gina, with stuffing policy in the budget. So the governor is going to make it so that people who suffer employment discrimination that have to file a suit or go before a commission in order to be protected will now suffer the possibility that not only do they have to pay their own attorney fees, they may be required to pay the attorney fees for their employer, which will have a chilling effect on people being able to come forward. Now, this is after our governor, as one of the very first policies that he passed when he became governor, made it impossible for people who for women who do not get equal pay for equal work, or veterans who are in those circumstances, that they no longer can file a cause of action in state court. They have to go to the federal court. Now, this could have a very chilling impact and once again make it very difficult for the average working person who desperately needs to be able to count on having the kind of access to justice that's so important in our society.
So that sounds like it will have the biggest impact for cases that don't involve a tangible benefit. For example, suits brought for reasons of discrimination or sexual harassment.
Well, if it's a perfect example, because the other calculation a person has to make is, what are my chances for success? Because you're going to suffer financially. And for many people, as we all know, wages have been suppressed over the course of the last 20 years in this country. But in Wisconsin in particular, Pew's last study showed that we had the most diminished middle class in the entire country. Now, the Journal did a re-estimate, and they said it might have gone up a couple points or something. But regardless, people do not have the kind of resources in many cases, if you're working for $10 or $11 an hour, to even afford your own attorney, much less take that risk that you may have to pay for your employer's attorney as well.
When you look at the budget proposals around education, included is a per student increase for schools, which on its face looks positive, but when you look deeper, it seems to come with some contingencies. Todd, can you talk to me a little bit about that?
You are correct. Every school district, in order to receive those increases, will have to, what they say, fully comply with Act 10. And what in the Kenosha Unified School District, what that will mean, even though all the teachers and administrators are already, quote, fully participating in Act 10, which essentially means a 12% pay cut. This is something that was not passed on to some of the very lowest wage workers in the school district. And now some of the lowest wage workers will essentially have to suffer a 12% wage decrease. And even though there is an increase in this year, and we all applaud that, of course, but kind of ironically, voucher schools will actually be getting more per school pupil than public school system. And we all know that the vast majority of people attending these voucher schools now are people that used to attend private schools, and now they're getting vouchers. It's just one more slap at public education.
And let me add two more points, if you don't mind, because Todd covered just very vitally important items. But there's two other things that people need to be aware of. One is that this amount of money to be put into public education does not even begin to make up for the cuts that the governor has made during his first 6 years in office. So even though it's good that finally, at least we're not getting another cut in education, nonetheless, that's bad enough. But then to add injury to insult, in addition, this money will only be there if, in fact, self-insurance is implemented and we save money as a result of self-insurance. You know, Deloitte, which is one of the major consulting groups in the country, did a study and found we would be just as likely to lose money as we would be to gain money. So the governor's budget is predicated on us actually implementing self-insurance and then making money as a consequence, which is far from certain that that's going to take place.
But I think that it's plain to see that the governor's budget is kind of designed for his reelection. So he can say that there's going to be an increase to public schools when there in fact may not be any increase, and in fact there is a larger increase to voucher schools.
Let's say, hypothetically, the budget passes as presented now. It sounds to me like much of the proposed funding is dependent on other factors and that there isn't a lot that's guaranteed.
That's exactly right, Gina, and on two scores, because on the first front, it's predicated on self-insurance and that actually saving money, which is, in my judgment, I think unlikely because the state insurance pool is made up of employees that are older than the average that tend to have more claims. Self-insurance is tailor-made for tech-type companies where you have young people that have few claims. But even taking that aside, then you compound that problem by the fact that now we're aware we have $1 billion structural deficit. So as the Finance Committee analyzes what steps need to be taken to try to bring it more in balance for the next fiscal year, they'll have a very difficult time being able to fund all the various arenas that the governor has given this false hope that there'll be money available. So on both fronts, it's going to be very difficult. Now, obviously, as a Democratic leader and someone that believes strongly in public education, I would certainly make that be the first priority in terms of ensuring that we are funding K-12, tech colleges, universities, because we know when we hear from businesses across the state, many of them have recognized that our future as a state is dependent on having strong education. And in fact, we're already having difficulty finding employees in some cases. So the future will belong to those states and those regions that have first-rate and high-class public education, which has long been a strong tradition and a value that we've had here in Wisconsin.
What are the consequences of districts being limited in the amount they can request property taxes to be increased to cover budget needs?
Well, I think that communities all throughout the state are getting hit very hard by the limitations that they have in order to raise taxes to the point that they need to. Every community is grappling with problems of whether or not they can hire an extra policeman if they think that they need to, or an extra fireman. And school districts are faced with a multitude of problems. There are schools like Kenosha that are close to Illinois. A teacher can decide to commute an extra 5 or 10 minutes, and first of all, receive much more generous raises, and also not be maligned by their legislature and their governor. And it's not just Kenosha. Certainly, you have the Hudson area that can move into Minnesota. So it's not just school districts that have a problem in terms of levy limits, but certainly municipalities as well.
Is there anything else in Governor Walker's budget proposal that really stuck out to you?
Well, the only other issue that we hear a great deal about from people across the spectrum is roads and infrastructure. And just in the last 2 weeks, one of the major publications came out with a report that said Wisconsin has the 49th worst roads in the entire nation. Now, this was no great surprise because the Federal Department of Transportation has said we have the third worst roads in the nation. And so we know that is a huge problem. And as a consequence, to try to come up with a solution is very difficult because the governor's put such impediments in saying that he would not even support things like indexing, which was a long tradition years ago that was suspended for a period of time. And so it's not just road construction, it's bridge construction, it's vertical construction. I've been on the board of the UW Wisconsin Parkside Foundation Board for almost 20 years now, and I was over there last week and toured Wiley Hall. And they desperately need to have a new heating and air conditioning unit put in for Wiley Hall. They've already had pipes burst. They showed the corrosion. In some cases, they're virtually completely shut so that water can't go through them anymore. And, this is what heats and cools the library at Parkside. So with a strategic break, you could have, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage. And the governor last session completely froze any kinds of projects like that for our UW system, vocational colleges, or any other kinds of deferred maintenance. And we know eventually you have to pay the piper. So whether it be roads, vertical construction, bridges, rural broadband, which is so vital for our future development of this state, we are in a hot mess here in Wisconsin. And the governor is not only not willing to lead on the issue, he actually is making it virtually impossible for the legislature to be able to come up with a proposal without the threat of him vetoing it.
The Democratic legislators in the state have recently put out a plan called the Wisconsin Way Forward. Could you explain a little bit about what that is?
Mm-hmm. Yes, what we've done is we recognize that there has to be an effort made to better communicate as Democrats alternative proposals and what our values are. I think the last election was really a shock to our system here in Wisconsin when we saw that many working class people, voted for Donald Trump. And so as a consequence, according to our allies, maybe the first time ever, but certainly the first time in any recent memory, the Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate came together around a unified agenda about fairness and opportunity and community and, trying to build an economy that works for everybody. So we have a website, wisconsindems.com, that we would invite people to go to, that we'll be continuing to build and develop. But it's an important step forward. I was pleasantly surprised. I represent both the Kenosha and the Racine area. And this morning at a breakfast in Racine, the facilitator of the breakfast, Bob Hensel, an attorney in Racine, handed out this packet to everybody. So when I walked in the room, everybody had it in front of them. I thought, oh my God, we have really made progress here. Yeah. So that was very exciting. And so I think people are getting the message. And increasingly, as I've gone and talked to groups, I spoke to the State Carpenters Association this week, and they all asked for copies, and we brought them over the next day right away. And so I think people are starting to get the message that we are much more organized, much more unified, and really trying to work with our allies outside the building that share the idea of going back to the kind of progressive values that made Wisconsin, one of the leading states in the nation for the last couple generations.
If I could just add something, unfortunately, we did have some working class people that defected to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. But equally as disturbing, and perhaps more significant, I'm not sure of the breakdown of the numbers, but the lack of people who voted in this last election. I think that the numbers are essentially 6,000 less in Kenosha County, 8,000 less in Racine, 43,000 less in Milwaukee, and these are voters who traditionally would have been voting Democratic. And for whatever reason, maybe because of just the way the campaign went and because of an unfocused campaign on the national level, we just did not have the numbers that we traditionally have, and that certainly hurt the election results. One reason for that is undoubtedly, it's hard to quantify exactly what level it is, but certainly the voter suppression bills that have been put into place in Wisconsin have something to do with that. Voter ID, all the things that they have made it harder for people to vote. So how much that actually accounted, we're not sure. I believe there's actually a study being done at UW-Madison in terms of to try to quantify that number.
What can be done to improve engagement and voter turnout in the future?
That's one thing that I'm really hopeful in terms of organizations like Foward Kenosha. Certainly we had a great victory in terms of the defeat of Ryan Care, Trump Care. And I think it's really truly as a result of the struggle of not just Foward Kenosha, but groups like them all throughout the country, hundreds if not thousands of new groups. And I think that sustained activity between now and the next election could really make the difference.
Could you talk a bit about the battle over redistricting that we're currently facing?
As you probably know, there was a 3-member panel of federal judges that voted that they found that the gerrymandering that was done by the Republicans in 2010 after the election was so clearly partisan that it really created an unconstitutional situation where people's voting power was actually stolen, by these elections. And now, of course, the Republicans are appealing that decision to the Supreme Court, and this is not a decision that the Supreme Court can decide whether they're going to take it or not. They have to hear it. We believe that it is certainly, we think that we have a pretty good chance of winning, even if there is a new court appointee by the time that they do hear it. We're quite confident, but one really tragic situation along the way is that, of course, they also decided when they that they're going to appeal it, they gave themselves a blank check that taxpayers will, of course, now defend the Republicans' position that it's okay to have an unconstitutional voting system where people's rights and power of their vote is taken away. So I'll let Peter talk on some details because I know he meets weekly on this situation.
Well, a couple things maybe I would add is that, first of all, why should people care about gerrymandering? It's a very, very important issue for a couple of reasons. First of all, it enables politicians to choose their voters instead of voters choosing their elected officials. And this is so wrong. The maps were put together, the plaintiffs have argued, the most partisan gerrymandered districts in the entire nation. And the federal judges bought that argument. Justice Kennedy has said that he is totally against these kind of gerrymandered districts and said if he had a rational basis for being able to rule in such a manner, he would rule against them. And so a mathematical formula was put together to, in fact, have the plaintiffs demonstrate why Wisconsin's districts are the most polarized. And there's a very direct correlation between us having the most polarized state in the nation and the most partisan gerrymandered districts because of the fact that when districts are largely 60% Democrat or Republican, what oftentimes occurs is people move further to the right or further to the left and they ignore the middle. And for Republicans in particular, it has been so evident in their policymaking in Madison, where it's been just breathtaking how far they have moved to the right in terms of taking away people's rights, like veterans who disproportionately been affected by asbestos poisoning, who historically Republicans and Democrats both have looked out for veterans' interests. But as we've actually heard them say on camera, when they didn't think people were listening, they said they believed they could win their district anyway. And so as a consequence, In many cases, we hear time and time again, people say they write to their legislator and they don't even get a response because they feel they don't need to respond to people in the other party. Now, if there's one thing I was taught in politics, is you work for the people who are in your district. And I don't care how Republican or Democrat they are. I know for Todd, myself, and most of the legislators in this area, we believe in responding to every single constituent, and that's as it should be. But when you draw these maps in such a way, people feel emboldened to ignore part of their constituency. Frankly, we saw that when Foward, Wisconsin had a hearing for Congressman Paul Ryan, who refused to show up. And this is not the only instance where we've seen this occur in Wisconsin, but because of the maps being drawn in such a manner, and Kenosha and Racine may have the best example of all, because Senator Van Wangard's district looks like a horseshoe going around Kenosha and Racine. My district looks like a Nike swish. I mean, just visually, they look ridiculous. But that aside, as the Kenosha News and the Racine Journal-Times both editorialized, no longer is there any point in voting after the primary in your state Senate elections in Kenosha and Racine because you already know the outcome because both districts are over 60%. And in Racine in particular, it's extremely egregious because we went from a Democrat to a Republican to a Democrat to a Republican and went back and forth in the last, I think, 6 or 7 or 8 elections because it was very much, a swing type district because we had many of those in the state of Wisconsin. So this is a very vital issue. I met with some attorneys from New York just this past week who have taken a special interest in this case. They're not even part of the plaintiff's attorneys, but they have a Wisconsin connection, and they're looking to weigh in an amicus brief, friend of the court brief, because they are just so outraged at what has taken place. And the pundits and those legal experts that have followed this closely feel the chances are very promising because Justice Kennedy has always been the swing vote in redistricting. So we're hopeful, given the fact that this federal court decision was written by a Ronald Reagan appointee. So it's a very important decision because it will have a lot to do with whether or not we're going to continue to have the kind of polarization that we've seen in Wisconsin ever since Scott Walker did what he called dropping the bomb back in February of 2011.
Can you clarify what districts this suit affects? Is it only on the state level or does it include congressional districts as well?
No, this suit only affects the state legislature, but the implications are vast because, in fact, if the court rules that way, then obviously any similar districts that were drawn in such a partisan manner will also be up for grabs.
And certainly the other district that was gerrymandered was Paul Ryan's. Paul Ryan's district used to be much more evenly balanced, and they just gave him a whole swath of a district that traditionally votes like 90% Republican.
What effort is being made to increase bipartisanship in the legislature?
Well, one thing I think certainly redrawing the map would make a much more bipartisan legislature. But just to speak on an issue that we will be bipartisan on, or certainly seems like we will, is a package of bills on the opioid crisis being actually, I think they heard it in some committee last week and will continue this coming week. But the opioid crisis is real. Kenosha now averages 1 death a week. In April, there were 8 people who died of heroin overdose or opiate overdose in Kenosha County. And without the use of Narcan, that number would have been 2 to 3 times higher. So that will be a bipartisan effort and important. And the use of Narcan will be expanded by those bills. So on occasion, we can get something right on a bipartisan basis. And I think that just shows that if there was truly a more bipartisan effort, that we would get a lot more done.
It's always up to the majority party because they control all the levers of government at this point. I mean, the governor, both houses of the legislature, arguably the Supreme Court, the Attorney General. And so, but it's been very narrow policy issues, at least over the course of the past 6 years since the governor's been in office, that they've chosen to reach out with Democrats. So it's more likely in these narrow circumstances as opposed to broad policy issues like funding education or infrastructure or health care. And that's unfortunate. my tenure in the legislature, I served in the late 80s and early 90s during my first tenure, prior to going to Congress and joining the Clinton administration and running a couple companies. Coming back, it's like a different place. When I was there before, I could cite a dozen examples of bills that, I passed on a bipartisan basis with Republican legislators, and the Democrats were completely in control of the legislature the entire time I was there. But we just felt that policies would be more sustainable and would last through Democrat and Republican governors if you work together. And we just haven't seen that being demonstrated over the course of the last 6 years. And as Representative Ohnstad said, so much of that is because of the partisan maps where they just feel it's not necessary anymore.
What is next for the Wisconsin Way Forward and for the state budget?
Well, the next step will be we'll have a policy document that will follow that will list the top priorities that we have as representatives in the Assembly and in the state Senate as Democratic legislators. And that document we're hoping will follow in not too many weeks. And then at the same time, simultaneously, obviously we're dealing with the budget. And, so the budget will start having agency briefings next week. There'll be public hearings then the following week, and they'll start voting the first week in May. So I would certainly encourage people to go to these public hearings that are being held around the state. It appears the only one in southeastern Wisconsin will be in the Milwaukee area, which I know is a tougher lift for people. And but whoever is able to go, I would recommend that they go. No, these are public hearings where people testify so that they can say they think it's wrong to eliminate people's ability to challenge employment discrimination, as we talked about earlier, or they can talk about the fact that school funding should not be dependent on whether or not we have self-insurance in this state, or any other issue that they feel strongly about that affects their family, affects their community, or affects the state as a whole. But then in addition, writing letters, sending emails, calling their elected officials, letting them know about the key issues that affect our state and our district. I mean, whether it be education, transportation infrastructure, whether it be healthcare, there are just so many issues that are vitally important to trying to build an economy that works for everybody. So both of those are going on simultaneously, and we started with this values document so that people could get a sense of the values that will underlie the various proposals that we'll be advancing, but also the kinds of things that we're going to be battling aggressively over the course of the next couple months in this budget.
Thank you both so much for taking the time to sit down with me and talk a little bit about these issues that are really important to us. And thank you also for coming to speak to us at our meeting. We really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I think that if there is one bright light out there, it's groups like Forward Kenosha, and I really think that will make the difference in 2018.
Yeah, we've been so impressed with the amount of outreach, with how quickly a website appeared and ideas were brought forward, and there was marches and hearings and meetings, and just like a burst of energy. And that's exactly, unfortunately, where we're at as a society, that you have to have that level of activism. And, the realtors back years ago used to have these buttons that said, politics is a participatory sport. And it is. And unfortunately, you've got to play it every single week in order to protect the interests and protect the values that I think made Wisconsin a unique, wonderful, family supportive, fair state for the people that we all are so privileged to represent.
That was Peter Barca and Tod Ohnstad. If you have any questions about what you heard in today's podcast, or you attended the meeting on April 3rd and you have questions that didn't have time to be asked or answered, please email us at forwardkenosha@gmail.com. We will collect the questions over the next few weeks, and then we will have a part 2 where Tod and Peter will answer the questions that you asked and touch on the issues that are really important to you. So thank you for listening, and hope that you tune in next time.